Hi, everybody. Last week you took your last major grade test over both world wars, the 1920s and Great Depression. Our fifth grade curriculum does not end there, however. We still have the Cold War to look at, Vietnam, Korean Wars, civil rights, which is what we're looking at today. And we're going to be going all the way to the year 2008 and the presidency of our first African American in the highest office of the land, and that was Barack Obama. And today we're going to look at civil rights, which, given the fact that we've had slavery in our past, that we've talked about, that we've had segregation in the United States, and that there continues to be lingering problems with racism in the United States. The fact that we had our first African American president elected in 2008 and now vice president, Kamala Harris, those are pretty significant accomplishments in our history. So, at any rate, we're gonna look at civil rights, and you'll have some other brain pop activities this week over significant civil rights individuals, and hopefully you'll learn something new about these incredible people. And let's go ahead and begin. So what are civil rights? And of course, you'll fill in the missing information on your note page. Civil rights are rights that are guaranteed to all citizens by the Constitution. Can you think of any examples of rights or freedoms? Well, there are important ones that we've talked about in the past. Freedom of speech, of religion, of assembly, freedom of petition, all sorts of different ones that we've talked about in the past when we've looked at the Bill of Rights. So if all citizens are guaranteed these rights, what's the problem? Well, it turns out not everyone in the United States was receiving the rights they deserved. African Americans and other minorities were forced to endure mediocre conditions. During the civil rights movement, people stood up for minorities and demanded equal rights for all. Segregation. Across the United States, especially in the South, African Americans experience segregation. Segregation is separation based on race. Schools, jobs, restaurants, theaters, bathrooms, and even water fountains were segregated. And of course, that goes for right here in the Bryan-College Station area as well. If you visit the African American Museum in Bryan, Texas, you'll see signs very similar to this that indicate where restrooms that were designated just for white people and others for colored. No dogs, no Negroes, no Mexicans were other signs that were popular in the South. And colored had to be seated in the rear of the bus, for example. So even here in the Bryan-College Station area, we had things of this nature, including segregated schools, all white schools and all black schools. Types of resistance. In response to segregation, civil rights leaders began to take action. They encouraged other African Americans to take a stand. While there was often danger and violence involved, most civil rights leaders called for passive resistance to oppose something without using violence. Some examples include sit-ins, protests by sitting in all-white restaurants, movie theaters, park benches, and bus seats. Boycotts, to refuse to do business with a company or group that segregates. Marches, a large gathering of people come together to show their support. Civil rights leaders. Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was an Alabama woman who refused to give up her seat in the white section of a bus. She was taken to jail simply for refusing to move seats. This led to the Montgomery bus boycott, where African Americans refused to ride a bus for more than a year. And the whole idea behind boycotts is to hurt a business where they think it will make the greatest impact. And if you have a large group of African Americans not riding the buses, that means those buses are not receiving money or payment. And so boycotts frequently are designed to target a business's wallet, so to speak, their economy, the way that they make money, so that they end up losing money when a boycott occurs. And they're very effective. Civil rights leaders. Ruby Bridges. Ruby Bridges was a young girl who became the first African American student at an all-white school. In 1960, Ruby was 6 years old when her parents enrolled her in this new school. They wanted her to receive a better education that she would receive at the black school. Ruby had to be escorted into the school by federal marshals for her protection. Many white students and teachers boycotted the school. It took a long time for the protests to die down, but Ruby helped us create the integrated schools we have today. And integrated, of course, means blacks and whites and people of color attending school all together instead of separate schools. Martin Luther King Jr. MLK Jr. was a minister and one of the main faces of the civil rights movement. He encouraged passive resistance and helped plan the March on Washington to influence Congress. At this march, MLK Jr. gave his extremely powerful "I Have a Dream" speech. Unfortunately, MLK Jr. was assassinated in 1968 at the height of his political influence. But MLK's vision was widespread, and his work for civil rights continued even after his death. Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson was the first African American baseball player allowed to play on an all-white team. He became a Brooklyn Dodger in 1947. Jackie and his teammates faced violence and threats for his participation on the team. Jackie promoted nonviolence, and his talents eventually gained him acceptance in the baseball world. He played in 6 World Series games and was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. His efforts broke barriers for other African Americans in baseball and across the country. Malcolm X. Malcolm X was an Islamic minister and advocate for African American rights. Unlike MLK Jr., Malcolm X is known for inciting violence in his fight for civil rights. He did not want integration like many other civil rights leaders fought for. He believed in black supremacy and was very harsh against critics. Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965. He had gained many followers across the country and is remembered as one of the most influential African Americans of all times. Major events. The Montgomery bus boycott. Rosa Parks was arrested in 1955 for sitting in the white section of a bus. African Americans rallied around her and organized a boycott of the Montgomery bus system. Almost every African American in Montgomery participated in the boycott, which lasted over a year. The bus system lost a lot of money and eventually gave in to the request. The bus system was desegregated in 1956. Freedom Rides. Freedom Rides were organized by civil rights activists in an attempt to integrate buses in the South. Activists rode from the north to southern states in integrated bus seats, but bus stations, restrooms, and water fountains. Opposition in the South was strong, and many Freedom Riders were jailed and or beaten. But soon after the rides began, a desegregation order was passed to integrate the busing system. March on Washington. In 1963, the major civil rights organizations came together to create a demonstration in Washington, D.C. Their goal was to convince the Kennedy administration that African Americans deserved better living and working conditions. 200 to 300,000 people gathered at the march, and Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. After the march, President Kennedy and Vice President Johnson committed to influencing Congress and helping the civil rights movement. Response to civil rights, the KKK. The Ku Klux Klan was the major force against the civil rights movement. KKK members believed in white supremacy and supported segregation. The KKK made it extremely difficult for civil rights activists. They used violence and fear to keep African Americans from making a change. Unfortunately, in some places, even the law officials were in the KKK. This made it even harder for African Americans to get a fair trial, and many were falsely accused of crimes. Legislation. Real change began to trickle through the United States as lawmakers started making segregation illegal. Brown versus Board. The Supreme Court ruled that segregation of public schools was illegal under the Constitution in 1954. The Civil Rights Act, a law that banned segregation in all public places in 1964. The Voting Rights Act, a law that protected the rights of all Americans to vote in 1965. Thousands of African Americans were able to vote for the first time. And one reason why this is so important is that even though African Americans were legally allowed to vote for many, many decades, there were oftentimes stumbling blocks placed in their way, preventing them from voting. For example, a poll tax, which meant that anybody that wanted to vote, in particular African American, had to pay a tax on property. And if they didn't have any property or couldn't pay a tax, then they could not vote. And the 24th Amendment to the Constitution actually makes a poll tax illegal, which was a major stumbling block that prevented many African Americans from across the country, especially the South, from voting. Civil rights today. The main civil rights movement lasted from 1954 to 1968. However, civil rights activism continues today. Did you know the KKK is still active in some parts of our country? Did you know racism is still a major problem? We need to continue growing as a nation in overturning racism. So things that we'll talk about in class and things you should consider. Have you ever felt inadequate based on something you couldn't control? Maybe the way you look, talk, or what you have. How did that make you feel? Do we do anything as a class to make people feel excluded? What can we do as a class that would make everyone feel more comfortable and involved? Write down in your notes what you can do today to make our classroom, or any classroom really and truly from here on out, a better place. So review questions that you will also answer are 1 through 12. You'll need to know what are civil rights examples and give examples. Who was a major leader at the March of Washington? Who refused to give up her seat and encouraged the Montgomery bus boycott? What was Ruby Bridges' role in the civil rights movement? Which leader did not encourage passive resistance? Who was a major African American leader in the sports world? Name the 3 types of resistance we discussed today. Which group made civil rights change very difficult for African Americans? Which law allowed many African Americans to vote for the first time? Which law is responsible for us having integrated schools today? Which law outlawed segregation in public places? And finally, what are we going to do today to make our classroom a better, happier place?